Welcome back, dearies. It's Chapter 2, Honor is Dead. And if we're talking about honour, then an honorary mention to the little bit of gubbins at the top of the chapter where we have another quote from someone and it says that they are 5 seconds before death, and she's saying weird sort of, fantasy book type stuff. 10 orders, we were loved once, why have you forsaken us, almighty? Shard of my soul, where have you gone? What does this mean? Will we ever find out? Stay tuned. In the meantime, Brandon Sanderson starts off Chapter 2 with the same little trick he pulled at the start of the previous 2 chapters, and as at the start of the previous 2 chapters, I like it and approve. If you'll cast your mind back, in the prelude some really big stuff happened with extremely monumentally powerful people in the past. And then on the immediate page after that, Book 1 started with the words 4,500 years later. We read the prologue knowing that the events of the prelude would have affected the world in some big way. And we followed the story of an assassin trying to kill a king. And then, in the next chapter, we find the words 5 years later, which implies that the killing of that king, which, I'm sorry to spoil, does happen. Not very sorry to spoil it, I've been very clear up till this point that you shouldn't be here if you don't know the story yet. We then embarked on Chapter 1, which began with the words 5 years later, so we know that not only has the original thing that happened in the prelude affected the whole world, but the comparatively minor thing, but still pretty major in its own day, that happened in the prologue will now have affected this world, because it doesn't just say at some point, or just not tell you when it starts, no, it says 5 years later, and later is the important word, because it implies that not only is this in the future, it's a sort of a subconscious cue that what happened in the previous chapter will have affected the world of this one. And in that chapter we met Kaladin and his squad, who are fighting in a silly little border skirmish, and we learned that Kaladin is basically the most amazing fighter there is, and everybody loves him, and he's a brilliant leader, and he's great, and everyone's going to be safe working under him in the army. And now, Brandon opens Chapter 2 with 8 months later, and I don't know about you, but I was surprised with the way that things had turned out. Now, I said I wanted a capital F fantasy book that had all of the tropes of fantasy and such in it, and here, sure enough, is one of them. In the previous chapter, we had the medieval battlefield scene reminiscent of Game of Thrones, or something that's more relevant that I haven't read and you have, and in this chapter, we get the opening to Skyrim, and I suspect that this book came before Skyrim, and now I've looked it up, and this book came out in 2010, and I realise I don't know when Skyrim came out, so that was useless, wasn't it? Evidently the battle did not go very well, and now Kaladin is rolling along in a cage on a cart that's being driven up through some mountains somewhere or something. He's starving, he's locked in with a load of other slaves, implying that he's a slave, and generally speaking everything is completely depressing and about as bad as it can be, he says cheekily, knowing full well it's going to get a lot worse. And after I talked at some length recently about how Spren are not fairies, we get a Spren that basically does seem to be a fairy. It isn't though, there's more of an implication that wind Spren are a particular kind of Spren that essentially have some of the characteristics that we would think of as a bit sort of fairy-ish. And here it is. Here's its first appearance. On a nearby mound, a small figure flitted around the plants, dancing like a fluttering insect. The figure was amorphous, vaguely translucent. Wind Spren were devious spirits who had a penchant for staying where they weren't wanted. He'd hoped that this one had gotten bored and left, but as Kaladin tried to toss his wooden bowl aside, he found that it stuck to his fingers. The wind Spren laughed, zipping by, nothing more than a ribbon of light without form. He cursed, tugging on the bowl. Wind Spren often played pranks like that. Silly, aren't they? Silly old wind Spren doing little pranks on people. So we find out that wind Spren are potentially the most interesting form of Spren. They ribbon about in the air without any real apparent form, presumably on gusts of air, or appearing to be travelling on gusts of air anyway. And on top of that, for some reason, wind Spren in particular play little tricks on people. We learn that Kaladin has been branded. He's got 3 brands on his forehead. The first 2 made a glyph pair, given to him 8 months ago on his last day in Amaram's army. 8 months ago, you say? 8 months ago. This happens 8 months later than the previous chapter. Was that battle his last day in Amaram's army? What on earth happened that made him be branded some sort of slave immediately after that fight? The obvious thing I thought of, and I'm going to tell you now that it is incorrect, is that Amaram's army simply lost the fight, the other side captured all of his soldiers and branded them as slaves. But as I've gone through the book, I've learned that not only is that not what happened, but that isn't what would happen. I don't think so, anyway. I suppose it's actually possible, because I don't remember anything that directly contradicts it, or being told what would happen, but when one High Prince fights another High Prince and wins, I've seen no evidence that he takes the losing High Prince's soldiers as slaves, so this has to be something else. And the third glyph, if I've rabbited on for too long for you to remember what we're talking about, given to him by his most recent master, Shash. The last glyph read, dangerous. His most recent master. So what we learn then is that Kaladin, after whatever happened at that fight 8 months ago, has been passed from hand to hand, generally as a slave, we assume, all the way along. He's been branded a slave, and then, after something that happened with his last master, he's been branded a dangerous slave. Well, I imagine he is. A man that good at fighting isn't going to be a very willing slave, may occasionally rouse a little rabble. may occasionally cause little bits of bother and stirs and so on, and quite rightly too. And then we learn the details. He has tried to escape. In fact, he has escaped 10 times. 10 escape attempts in 8 months, fleeing from 5 different masters. And each time, he's wound up back being a slave again. Why? Because he's got the brand on his head. He's a slave. Everyone knows he's a slave, so they just contact whoever the local person in charge of that sort of thing is, and he presumably gets shipped off to whoever owns him or is next going to own him. We find out a lovely little detail about the world here. The grass retreats whenever anything weird is happening near it, such as the cart going past. And by retreat, I mean it literally sucks into the ground. And it hasn't evolved to do that because of carts going past, it's evolved to do that because of high storms. All of the local flora has. There are different kinds of plant around here that just sort of shrink into themselves or in some way go into some kind of protective Class B sort of a shape whenever there are disturbances in the air nearby that would indicate the coming of a high storm, which is like a really strong storm that we're going to hear quite a lot about over the course of this book. And of course that means a lot of false alarms, so if you just walk through the grass, it will shrink into the ground, and different plants around you will shrivel up and stuff. And then, as you pass them by into the distance, they start to open up again behind you. So that's interesting, isn't it? That's pretty good. And what it tells us is that these storms are going to be a really big thing. They're going to be really strong and devastating. Men who had no honour, thinks Kaladin to himself in a little deviation. Were there men who had honour? No. Honour died 8 months ago. What happened 8 flipping months ago? There's a little bit of throwaway dialogue which I'm going to mention here because it yields a bit of important information about the world we're living in here, which is that one of the other slaves in there with Kaladin stole a herd of something called chulls, and doing so is kind of an alternative to stealing horses, but with less punishment attached. So I don't think we quite know what chulls are yet, but we know that they're big animals, a bit like horses. They come in a herd, and someone who might want to steal horses would be prepared to steal chulls instead, despite the fact that they're slower. So, chulls. What are chulls? And now, finally, we find out why Kaladin was branded a slave. He killed a Light Eyes. But then he says killing the Light Eyes wasn't why I was made a slave. It's the one I didn't kill that's the problem. What? And now we see our first chulls. They are large crustaceans, a rough size and shape of boulders, and they can be used as mounts. So already we're in a fantasy world where the grass sucks into the ground because of amazing storm winds, and people ride giant crabs around everywhere. At this point, something really weird happens. That Windspren from a moment ago shows up, this time in the form of a young woman. And here we really are in fairy territory. That's what's going on here. We've got a little translucent fairy flitting about, and it turns out that's nothing that weird. Larger Spren can change shape and size. What's weird is that this one knows his name. Kaladin, why must you ignore me? It says. And that's really weird, because Spren, they're not little... And that's really weird, because Spren, they're not little people, they can't think. Some of them can kind of parrot sounds back if they're the really big ones. Some of them can parrot sounds back if they're the bigger ones like Windspren or Riverspren, but they don't use your name. But conveniently nobody else saw it because some of the larger Spren, like Windspren, can pick a person and only be visible to them while they're tormenting them, so oh well. Gets weirder though, this Spren seems to be able to remember stuff that he's done previously, which again is not a thing Spren can do. And then we learn that Kaladin has some deaths in his history. They were all dead. Sen and Dalit. Oh dear, the protagonist from the first chapter. We saw Kaladin through their eyes before. We're in his head now, but we saw it through Sen before. And then Dalit was the guy in between Sen and Kaladin, and then there was Kaladin off in the distance being amazing. Well, they're both dead now. And before that, Tux and the Takers. Before that, Tien. It's T-I-E-N, and if anyone out there knows how to pronounce it, I will be happy to edit the way I pronounce it, along with any of the names and words and so on in this book. For now, I'll pronounce it Tien, and Tien is dead. And before that, blood on his hands, and the corpse of a young girl with pale skin. Oh dear, he seems to have a lot of dead people in his past, doesn't he, this Kaladin? The slave owner that's driving them all about in this cart is called, oh gosh, Tvlakv. T-V-L-A-K-V. Something tells me I'm not really expected to be able to pronounce that very easily. Anyway, he notices that one of the other slaves seems to be really ill, and Kaladin seems to know in exactly what way he's ill and what's wrong with him, and how to cure it, or at least help it along. So Kaladin explains how to keep him alive, but the slave owner instead decides to just kill the guy so that he doesn't infect the others, which he wouldn't because he wasn't infectious. Which Kaladin tried to explain, but nobody's listening to Kaladin. Kaladin is furious about this, and he's about to try and kill the guy using these really poisonous leaves or something that he's managed to gather up as time has gone by and hide in his belt. But it turns out he was so cross that he kind of crushed them up in his fists and dropped all the bits, and rubbish, they're all gone. What a terrible attempt at killing anybody with anything. And so Kaladin is left a giant failure with blood coming down his face from this brand that's just been stamped on onto his head, and a little windspren flitting around, somehow knowing his name, everything being a bit weird. And yes, he has a mind to take revenge, but he doesn't have the means, and after several attempts at escape, he's even given up on that, so he's not going to be doing that again. So we've seen Kaladin go from a skilled and respected fighter in an army with a good position and everybody loves him, on the cusp of getting his dream, which is to go and fight in the real war that's going off somewhere else, to this, a slave locked in a cage with no food and no hope and absolutely nothing, and everything's terrible. Oh dear, oh dearie dear. Presumably, this being a fantasy book, it's gonna go uphill at some point, but when? So we're left with a couple of mysteries, aren't we? Firstly, and this is the main one, what is going on with this Spren? How did it know his name? How did it act sentient? How did it remember things? Now, any of you who don't read genre fiction very much will be going, well, magic, presumably. I mean, it's a magic thing, we already know that. Why is anybody surprised by it doing weird things or magic things? To that, I say this. Yes, that's all well and good, but the thing is, Brandon has actually established the rules here. Yes, he's introduced these things that we don't have in the world and will be magic to us, but he's told us that it's weird, there's never been one that can do the things that this one has done. So, at that point, the rules have been established, and I'm personally perfectly happy to go along with them and go, okay, then that's weird, alright, I wonder why it's happening. Because by saying that there's something about this one that's weird, by bringing that up as a weird thing anyway, he's saying this isn't going to turn out to be a case of, well, it's magic. This is going to be a case of something's actually going on here that you're going to be interested to find out about. One of his things is setting up magical systems where there are rules, rigid rules that must be followed. And yes, those rules are magic and the whole magic system is magic, so to an extent he does get to just make them up and they can be anything he wants, but the point is he'll make them up to make a certain amount of sense, and once he's made them up, he will stick to them. All of which means in this particular case that yes, Spren cannot do the things that this Spren has been doing, so yes, it is weird and interesting. What's more, we learned about Seth's power, all that lashing stuff in the prologue. We can rest assured that from now on, everything he can do with those powers is going to make sense given the rules that we were given at the start. Think of them as like the laws of robotics if you're an Asimov reader. We know what can and can't be done, and from now on, all of the intrigue is going to be around how to interpret those rules and how the character works within those rules and what comes to disrupt them. It's unlikely, for instance, that Brandon will just invent a new thing that he can do. Oh, and by the way, there's this other thing you can do with lashing that I didn't tell you about, and if he does, then it will fit in a really logical way with what he has already told us. That's the way Brandon Sanderson works, and so that's the way we read. So that's mystery number one. Mystery number two is what's going on with all of these dead people back in Kaladin's past. Who is the young girl who died? And I wrote this down in my notes the first time I read this chapter. Who is the young girl who died? Did Kaladin kill her, or just fail to save her? Because all we know is that he has her blood on his hands, and there's her corpse, and it's his first real memory of death. But there's plenty more memories of death after it, and having read further into the book, I'm now just as interested in those, or one of them in particular. My response to this chapter when I first read it was that I was interested about the way it was placed, because this is a scene that could have been used as chapter 1, the very first thing in the book. I already mentioned how the opening of Skyrim starts with some guys in a cart against their will being trundled off to some form of justice. Well, here the same opening would have worked, but I'm glad that he didn't put it there, because the tone of this chapter is so desolate and desperate and painful and slow. As an opening, it would have been way too much of a downer, but having shown how amazing he was and how at home he was and essentially in what happy company he was in the previous chapter, this chapter comes therefore as a surprise. So rather than going, oh okay, we open on a glum situation, this is a world of glum situations, and you know, at that point of course I'd be making more comparisons to Game of Thrones yet again, because you know, my frame of reference for fantasy stuff I guess is a bit narrow, and so I have sort of that and Lord of the Rings and a couple of other things to go by. So that's what I would have thought. This is all a bit Game of Thronesy, all of this, you know, glumness and downeriness. But no, this way, that sort of tone comes as a surprise, as a twist, as a change from the previous chapter, which, alright, wasn't really happy or anything, because you had this kid who was trapped in this war he didn't understand, but it's nevertheless a jump in tone. That chapter was all hopeful, because there was the amazing Kaladin. Kaladin was the source of hope in the previous chapter, where a terrible battle would clearly just become fine if Kaladin's there. But no, that's not what happened. And now Kaladin is the one trapped in a cage and everything's just really desolate and horrible. So it's good that it came in that order, otherwise I'd just be reading this going, oh dear, this is unpleasant. If anything, putting it in that order kind of added a certain sense of excitement to such an unpleasant and gloomy scene, because we get the sense already that the status quo has been massively broken this early in the book, and we know we're going to get a variety of different situations presented to us instead of just being sort of stuck in one place. However, for now, Kaladin is very much stuck in one place, and so all of these feelings go together and we go like, he will obviously get out of this situation, but how and when? So my impression of this chapter was that it was really slow and unhappy. But But it was broken up in a really pleasant way by the introduction of this sudden fairy thing. And he's doing something else clever with that Windspren. He's making the fairy companion, which is absolutely a trope in fantasy. You know, that could be really, really boring. But he's making it interesting by pointing out straight away from the off that fairies cannot be companions. They're just motes in the air that nobody takes any more notice of than they do a passing fly or a little bit of dust or something. They can't communicate, but this one is. And in doing so, it becomes a fairy, something we're expecting and used to in a fantasy situation, but by being told that this is a world that doesn't have those, we're going, well, what's up with this one then? It must have come from somewhere or been created by something. There must be some story behind this one. Why is there a fairy here, we're going, instead of, there's a fairy here, of course. Spren we have learned about in this chapter, according to my notes, include Windspren, larger than the others, amorphous ribbons of light, can take on any shape and even mimic human voices, but don't actually have language or intelligence of that sort until now, apparently. Rot Spren, tiny, red, Kaladin expects to see them gathering round his brand scabs, and River Spren, which are just larger Spren, but we don't know anything else. A few more details we learn about the world, which I shall rattle off nice and quick, because this part was really tedious to edit previously. Alethi have dark hair, Blackbane is a narrow leaf on a trefoil prong, and is poisonous. Bluth is a slab-faced mercenary, Sen is dead, Chul's a giant crustacean mount, Dalet is dead. The grinding coughs, or the grindings, is a kind of illness characterised by coughing with an excess of phlegm and fevered mumbling at night. Cure, administer 2 handfuls of blood ivy crushed to a powder each day. Failing that, keeping the patient hydrated with plenty of liquids, stirred with sugar if available, should keep them alive. I wrote that down in case the information became important later. It doesn't. What's being communicated here, rather, is not how to treat it, but that Kaladin knows how to treat it. High storms. In the unclaimed mountains there are storms, so crazy that the local plant life has adapted to avoid them. The grass literally retracts into the ground instantly when disturbed, and pops back up again when the coast is clear. Kaladin's father had a lot to say about healing and protecting people. Maybe he was some sort of medic. He seems to be the reason Kaladin knows how to treat wounds and various ailments, and it's his voice in Kaladin's head that prevents him from leaving anyone to die if he can help them. But so far, it seems like he kind of can't, and has a massive bee in his bonnet about the fact that he can't save people all the time and they keep dying. Salas, a violet-coloured moon. Taln's scar, a swathe. Taln's scar, as in Talonel, as in the guy as in the herald that was trapped in hell. Taln's scar, a swathe of deep red stars that stand out from the white ones. Something along the lines of a sort of Milky Way but red. I wonder if that ties in with stuff that he's already figured out, like he knows what galaxies are out there and stuff. You never know with this fella. In fact, as I understand it, I hear that some or all of Brandon's books are connected together into some kind of big conjoined reality, so maybe he's already written about stuff going on in this Taln's scar galaxy elsewhere in another book. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll find out. Probably. Taran is a lanky serving boy who tends to the Chul's. Thalen, all Thalen men, regardless of their age, have white beards and white eyebrows that grow crazy long, and they have to, put them over their heads or style them in some way. Tien, someone else Kaladin has failed, i.e. probably failed to keep from being killed before Tux and the Takers. Tux and the Takers are people who died before Sen and Dalit, who Kaladin should have saved. Tuvlakv is the Thalen slaver who currently owns or is transporting Kaladin and company. He's a Thalen, so white beard and eyebrows, which he wears pushed back over his ears, making them look like white streaks in his otherwise black hair. Portly, brown-eyed, limping, black and red striped trousers, blue sweater and knit cap, both once fine, now ragged. Very wary of Kaladin, whose last escape attempt involved 20 armed slaves. Flippin' heck. Kaladin is a guy who can get together 20 slaves, arm them, unless they were already armed, I'm doubting they were already armed because they were slaves, and make them do a little bit of an uprising. But he's not very good at it, and they all got captured, or presumably the rest of them got killed, and maybe they were the Takers, I don't know. And finally, Vorin, which we've heard about before. Do you remember the Vorin religion, where I wasn't sure if it was a people or a religion? Now I'm leaning back towards people, because they have rules about the use of slaves, and these rules do not apply outside, and so that's where Kaladin and company are being taken. There we go. That's today's visit to the book corner. Next time we will start chapter 3, which is called, where have I put the book? City of Bells. It's a nice chapter, and in it we're going to be meeting another main character. So I shall see you there. Off you pop and read that chapter if you haven't already, and I shall see you forthwith. Farewell.